Iris Colton stood on the wet pavement outside the only home she had known for 47 years, 81 years old, widowed 6 months prior, with 2 suitcases at her feet and her late mother's Bible pressed against her chest, and the bank that had just changed the locks behind her had no idea that tucked inside that Bible, folded between the pages of Psalms, was a document that would change everything. She had signed papers she did not fully understand during the worst year of her life, trusting Edmund the way you trust someone after half a century of marriage. And now Edmund was gone, and the house was gone, and the garden she had planted before some of her grandchildren were born was gone with it. That night, alone in a room that smelled of disinfectant and other people's sorrow, she opened the Bible the way she had opened it 1,000 times before, and what fell from between its pages was the last thing her mother had ever done for her. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The movers had come at 8 in the morning. Iris had been awake since 4, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea she had not drunk, in the particular stillness of someone who has already said goodbye to a place in their mind and is now waiting for the body to catch up. She had arranged everything herself. Her daughter Roberta had driven up from Columbus the week before and offered to stay for the moving day itself, and Iris had thanked her with the quiet firmness of a woman who knows the difference between needing help and needing company, and had told her that this part was hers to do alone. The house on Sycamore Lane had been hers and Edmund's since the spring of 1976, 47 years. She had moved in at 34, a young woman with a second-hand sofa and a box of her mother Opel's recipes and a certainty about the future that only people who have not yet lost much can fully sustain. She knew the house the way you know a face you have looked at every day for most of your life, not by thinking about it, but by a knowledge that lives in the hands and the feet, the kind that does not require confirmation. She knew the sound, the second step made coming down the stairs in the morning, the way the back window swelled in July so that you had to lean into it with your shoulder to get it open, and the precise quality of the winter light in the front room on a January afternoon when it came in low and golden through the elm tree Edmund had planted in the yard in 1981. Edmund had worked for 30 years as an insurance adjuster, a methodical man who moved through the world with the careful deliberateness of someone who has seen what happens when people fail to plan. He had handled their finances from the beginning because he was precise about numbers in a way she was not, and the arrangement had been comfortable and had never given her cause to question it. She had trusted him with the financial life of their marriage the way she trusted him with everything else, completely and without reservation. The movers finished before noon. Iris walked through each room one final time, alone. The living room where Edmund's armchair still held the impression of 40 years of evenings, the kitchen where she had cooked 47 years of meals, the good ones and the difficult ones, and the ordinary Tuesday suppers that accumulated over decades into a life. The bedroom where she had said goodbye to Edmund on a Tuesday in March, holding his hand while the morning light came through the curtains she had made herself in 1989 and had never once considered replacing. She did not cry during the walk-through. She had developed, in the 6 months since Edmund died, a working understanding of her own grief, its patterns and its rhythms, and she knew the tears would come later and in private. The bank's representative arrived at 12:30. He was young, perhaps 30, in a company jacket with a set of new keys, and he had the expression of someone carrying out a task he had separated himself from in the way that professional necessity sometimes requires. He nodded at Iris, she nodded back. She did not make it easier for him, but she did not make it harder either. She picked up her 2 suitcases. She picked up her mother's Bible from the porch railing and held it against her chest. She walked to the taxi waiting at the curb. She did not look back at the house. She had looked at it enough. The Millbrook Inn was 6 blocks from Sycamore Lane. Room 9 was on the ground floor at the end of a corridor that smelled of pine cleaner and old carpet. It had a window that faced the parking lot, a small table with 1 chair, and a bed with a coverlet the color of old mustard. Iris set her suitcases in the corner. She set the Bible on the table. She sat on the edge of the bed, and for the first time since 4 in the morning she stopped moving. The weight of the day settled over her all at once. She was 81 years old. She was a widow. She was sitting in a room that smelled of pine cleaner 6 blocks from the home where she had lived her entire adult life. And the thing she had been carrying underneath all the practicalities of the day was fully present now, without any buffer between her and it. She reached across the table and pulled her mother's Bible toward her. It was not a reflex exactly, and not a habit, though she had read it most mornings for as long as she could remember. It was something closer to instinct, the reaching for a thing that has always been there when other things have not. She opened it, and something fell out. Iris had not always been the kind of woman who stayed in one place. As a girl growing up in rural Kentucky, she had imagined herself somewhere else, somewhere larger, somewhere with the particular energy of a city that announces itself from a distance. She had been 22 when she moved to Millbrook, Indiana, following a job at a textile company that no longer exists, and she had not intended to stay. Millbrook was not the somewhere else she had imagined. It was a modest town with a grain elevator and 3 churches and a hardware store that had been owned by the same family since 1932, and it did not announce itself from any distance at all. It simply was what it was, without apology or ambition. She met Edmund at a church social in the autumn of 1968. He was 30 years old and already carrying the particular steadiness of a man who has decided what he thinks about most things and is comfortable with what he has decided. He was not dramatic. He did not tell stories about himself. He asked her questions and listened to the answers with the full attention of someone who is genuinely interested, which she had found, by 26, to be rarer than it should be. They were married 14 months later in the same church where they had met, and she wore her mother Opel's pearl earrings, which Opel had driven up from Kentucky to fasten into her ears the morning of the wedding, and had fastened carefully and without ceremony in the way she did everything. Opel Trescott had been a woman of few words and deep convictions, the kind of person whose silence communicated as much as other people's speeches. She had raised Iris alone, after Iris's father left when Iris was 9, working as a seamstress and later as a bookkeeper for a lumber company, managing the finances of a small life with the precision and dignity of someone who understands that there is no circumstance in which self-pity is useful. She had visited Millbrook twice a year until her health made travel difficult, and then Iris had driven down to Kentucky twice a year instead, sitting with her mother at the kitchen table in the house where she had grown up, drinking coffee and talking about the things that mattered and not talking about the things that didn't, in the easy shorthand of people who have known each other long enough to have developed their own language. Opel had died in the spring of 2015, at 89, in the same house she had lived in for 50 years. Iris had been with her. She had held her mother's hand the way she would later hold Edmund's, in the particular stillness of someone who understands that presence is the only thing left to offer. Opel had left her very little in the material sense. The house in Kentucky had been sold to cover the end-of-life expenses. There was a small savings account, a cedar chest of quilts and linens, and the Bible. The Bible had been Opel's mother's before it was Opel's, a worn King James with a cracked spine and pages that had softened over decades of use to the texture of old cloth. Iris had taken it without question because it was the thing she most wanted, and she had kept it on the nightstand on her side of the bed and read from it most mornings for the 8 years since her mother had died. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She had not known there was anything inside it beyond the words. Edmund's illness had arrived in the way of things that rearrange everything without asking permission. The diagnosis came on an ordinary Wednesday, delivered in the flat, careful language of a doctor who has learned to separate the information from the emotion because the emotion is the patient's to carry, not his. It was serious. The treatments were available. The treatments were also expensive in the way of things that insurance covers partially and the patient covers the rest of, and the rest of, Edmund had told her quietly, would require some adjustments. She had accepted this. She had trusted him. She had been trusting him with the numbers for 45 years, and the arrangement had always worked, and she had not thought to examine it differently simply because the circumstances had become harder. What she had not known was the nature of the adjustment. Edmund had not told her because Edmund processed his worries the way he processed everything, inward, alone, resolved before it became someone else's burden. He had taken out a loan against the equity in the house on Sycamore Lane, a reverse mortgage, the kind that does not come due while the borrower is living in the home and that comes due all at once when he is not. He had used the money to fund 3 years of treatment. He had bought them 3 more years together, and he had not told her, because telling her would have required her to choose between the money and his life, and he had decided, without consulting her, which one to protect. It was. Iris had come to understand in the months since, both the most loving thing he had ever done for her and the most costly. The bank's letter arrived on a Monday in October, 7 months after Edmund's funeral. It came in an ordinary white envelope with a return address Iris did not recognize, sandwiched between a water bill and a catalogue for gardening supplies she had not requested. She opened it at the kitchen table with her morning coffee, in the same chair she had sat in for 47 years, and she read it twice before she fully understood what it was saying. The language was not cruel. It was precise and formal and clear in the way of documents written by people who have learned to deliver difficult information without ornamentation. The reverse mortgage on the property at 14 Sycamore Lane, Millbrook, Indiana, had come due upon the death of the borrower, Edmund Harold Colton. The outstanding balance was stated in a number that Iris read 3 times. The options available to her were outlined in 4 short paragraphs. They led in most directions to the same conclusion. She did not have the funds to satisfy the loan. The house would transfer to the bank's ownership in 60 days. She sat with the letter for a long time. The coffee went cold. Outside, the elm tree Edmund had planted in 1981 was doing what it did every October, turning the particular amber gold of Midwestern autumn that she had watched from this window for more years than she could count without effort. The tree did not know anything had changed. The garden did not know. The house itself, with its creaking second step and its swelling back window and its January light, did not know. Only Iris knew, sitting alone at the kitchen table with a letter in her hands and 47 years pressing in around her from every direction. She called Roberta that evening. Roberta drove up from Columbus the following weekend and sat across from her at the same table and went through the paperwork with the focused attention of a woman who works in hospital administration and has learned to read difficult documents without flinching. She made calls. She spoke with the bank's loan servicing department and with a HUD-approved housing counselor whose number the bank's letter had provided. The counselor was thorough and patient and confirmed what the letter said. The timeline was what the letter stated. The options were what the letter described. Roberta had sat across from her afterward with the expression of a daughter who has run out of avenues and is not yet ready to say so. Iris had looked at her daughter and had felt, beneath the grief of the situation, a separate and quieter grief for Roberta, who had driven 2 hours to fix something that could not be fixed and was having to learn, at 53, that some things cannot be fixed. She had signed the reverse mortgage documents, she learned, during the period of Edmund's most intensive treatment. There had been a stack of paperwork, medical forms and financial authorizations and insurance documents, and Edmund had set the reverse mortgage papers in the stack without identifying them separately. Not out of deception exactly, but out of the same instinct that had always led him to resolve things before presenting them to her, to hand her the solution rather than the problem. She had signed where he had indicated. She had not read every page. She had been managing his care and her own fear simultaneously, and she had trusted him, and she had signed. She did not spend much time in anger about this. She had felt it, in the weeks after discovering what the documents contained, the particular anger of someone who has been protected from a choice they deserved to make. But anger at Edmund had always had a short horizon, not because she excused him, but because the shape of what he had done was visible to her clearly enough. He had borrowed against the only asset they had to fund treatments that gave them 3 more years together. He had made the decision alone because making it together would have required her to weigh in on whether his life was worth the house, and he had not been willing to ask her that question. She understood this. Understanding it did not make the consequence less real, but it changed the texture of the loss. It was not betrayal exactly. It was love, expressed in the particular and imperfect way of someone who believes that protecting the people he loves means not letting them share the weight. The 60 days passed the way of time that is both too fast and too slow simultaneously. Iris spent them in the practical management of leaving, sorting what would go to storage, what would go to Roberta's basement, what would be released entirely. She gave away more than she kept, not because she had stopped valuing things, but because she had, at 81, a clear sense of what belonged to a life and what belonged only to a place, and the place was no longer hers to keep. She kept the Bible. It had belonged to her grandmother before it belonged to Opel, and it had belonged to Opel for 60 years before it came to her, and it was not a thing that required a house. It was a thing that required only a hand to carry it. She carried it. She had no idea what else she was carrying with it. It was a small thing, the way it fell. There was no drama in it. no particular moment of intention. Iris had opened the Bible the way she always opened it, from the front, her thumb running along the inside edge of the cover the way it had done 10,000 times before, and the pages had fallen open somewhere in the middle, as old Bibles do, at the place they have been opened most. Psalms. Her mother's most read section, the margins faint with pencil marks Opel had made over 50 years and never explained to anyone, and from between those pages, dislodged by the particular angle of the opening, two things fell into her lap. The first was a key. It was old, simple, the kind made before keys became complicated, attached by a short length of twine to a small cardboard tag on which someone had written, in handwriting she recognized immediately as her mother's, a single word. She picked it up and held it under the lamp on the bedside table. The word on the tag was, "Yours." The second was a piece of paper, folded twice into a small square, soft at the creases in the way of something that has been folded and unfolded many times before being folded a final time and put away. Iris set the key on the table. She unfolded the paper slowly, not because she was being careful, but because her hands had gone very still in the way they sometimes did when some part of her understood, before her mind did, that she was handling something that mattered. It was a property deed. She recognized the form immediately because she and Edmund had received one very much like it in 1976, and she had kept it in the fireproof box in the bedroom closet for 47 years, and had seen it again only recently when she had retrieved it to understand what could and could not be claimed against the house. She knew what a property deed looked like. She read the one in her hands with the careful attention of someone who is making sure she is reading what she thinks she is reading, a parcel of land and the structure upon it. Calder's Landing, Vermont, dated 1987, in the name of Opel Ruth Trescott. She read it again. Then she looked at the key with the cardboard tag, "Yours." She sat on the edge of the bed in room 9 of the Millbrook Inn and held the deed and the key and was very quiet for a long time. Outside, the parking lot was lit by a single overhead lamp that cast a flat yellow light across the empty spaces. Somewhere down the corridor, a television murmured through the wall. The room itself was still, and Iris was still inside it, and the stillness had a different quality now than it had had 20 minutes earlier, when it had been simply the stillness of exhaustion. Now it was the stillness of someone trying to absorb something that does not absorb quickly. Her mother had owned property, her mother, who had raised her alone on a seamstress's wages and a bookkeeper's salary, who had sold the Kentucky house to pay her end-of-life expenses, who had left Iris a cedar chest and a Bible, and a small savings account that had covered 4 months of modest living. Her mother had owned a piece of land in Vermont with a structure on it since 1987, for 26 years before her death, and she had said nothing. She had visited Millbrook twice a year and sat at Iris's kitchen table and drunk coffee and talked about the things that mattered, and she had never once mentioned it. Iris thought about her mother. She thought about Opel's particular quality of silence, the way she had always communicated more through what she did not say than through what she said, the way she had fastened the pearl earrings on the morning of Iris's wedding without ceremony or sentiment, and had simply pressed her hands against Iris's shoulders for a moment afterward. And that had been the whole of it. Opel had not been a woman who explained herself. She had been a woman who acted and let the action speak when she was no longer there to speak for herself. She had tucked a deed and a key into the Bible she knew Iris would keep. She had written one word on the tag. She had trusted that Iris would find it when Iris needed to find it, which was a thing so precisely characteristic of Opel Trescott that Iris felt, sitting in that flat-lit room 6 blocks from the house she had just lost, something that was not quite her mother's presence, but was close enough to it that the distinction barely mattered. She did not sleep that night. She sat at the small table with the deed and the key and her phone, and she looked up Calder's Landing, Vermont. She found it on the map. She found the road where the property sat, and then she did what her mother, she suspected, had always known she would do. She began making plans. She told Roberta on the phone the next morning. There was a long silence on the other end, the particular silence of someone processing information that does not fit into any existing category. Then Roberta asked if she was certain the deed was real. Iris said she was. Roberta asked if she wanted her to come with her. Iris said no. Roberta asked 3 more questions in quick succession, the questions of a practical woman who loves her mother and expresses that love through logistics, and Iris answered each one patiently, and then told her daughter that she would call when she arrived. She left Millbrook on a Thursday morning on a bus that departed at 6:45. She had one suitcase, her carry bag, the Bible, and the key with its cardboard tag, which she had transferred to the inside pocket of her coat where her hand could reach it without looking. The deed she had folded carefully and placed between the same pages of Psalms where it had waited for however long it had waited, which she did not yet know but intended to find out. The journey to Calder's Landing took the better part of 2 days, with an overnight stop in Pittsburgh and a second bus connection in Burlington that deposited her at a small station in the late afternoon of the second day. She had a window seat both legs of the trip, and she spent the hours in the particular alert stillness of someone traveling towards something unknown and managing the not knowing by staying very present in each successive hour. She watched the landscape change, the flat, open geometry of Indiana giving way to the rolling terrain of Ohio and Pennsylvania, and then the mountains of upstate New York, and then Vermont itself, which announced itself differently than the states before it, more vertical, more forested, the light coming through the trees at a different angle than she was used to, as though the sun here had its own ideas about where to fall. She had looked up Calder's Landing on her phone during the overnight stop in Pittsburgh. It was a small town in the northeastern part of the state, the kind of place that appeared on maps as a dot without a circle around it. The photographs she found showed a main street with an independent hardware store and a diner and a post office in a building that appeared to have been a barn at some earlier point in its life. There were photographs of the lake, which she had not known was there. Calder Lake, wide and cold-looking and surrounded by birch and maple in the particular Vermont way that made the whole thing look like something painted rather than simply existing. There were no photographs of the road where the property sat. She would see that when she got there. The cab driver from the Burlington station knew Calder's Landing without needing to check. He was a man of perhaps 60 with the unhurried manner of someone who has driven these roads long enough that they require no particular attention. He told her it was about 40 minutes out and asked if she had been before. She said no. He nodded and said nothing else, which she appreciated. The town was smaller than the photographs had suggested and more settled-looking, the way real places always are compared to their photographs, which select the picturesque and omit the ordinary. She noted the diner, the hardware store, a small library and a white clapboard building with a flagpole out front. Then they were through the town and on a road that curved north along the edge of the lake, and the lake appeared between the trees on her left, going in and out of view as the road bent, wide and still in the late afternoon light, the birches along the shore bone-white against the dark water. The cab turned onto a gravel road that climbed slightly, away from the lake, into a stand of maples that had gone full autumn color in the way of Vermont in October, which is not subtle. The gravel road ended at a gate that was not locked. Beyond the gate, a path of flat stones led through overgrown meadow grass toward a structure set back from the road, partially screened by 2 large maples that had been young when her mother bought this land and were now 40 years old and very certain of themselves. Iris paid the driver. She took her suitcase. She stood at the gate for a moment and looked at the property in the late afternoon light and felt something she did not try to name immediately because it was too large for quick naming, and she had learned over 81 years that the things which are too large for quick naming are usually the things most worth sitting with. She opened the gate. She walked the flat stone path through the meadow grass. She took the key from her coat pocket, and she put it in the lock of the door her mother had last opened, and she turned it, and it gave, and she went inside. The inside of the property smelled of cedar and cold air and the particular dry stillness of a space that has been closed for a long time, but was well sealed before it was closed. It was not the smell of neglect, it was the smell of patience. Iris stood in the doorway for a moment before she stepped fully inside. The way you pause at the threshold of something you understand will matter before you understand why. The main room was modest in size and generous in care. The floorboards were wide pine, worn smooth in the paths between the door and the kitchen and the window that faced the meadow, the paths of a person's daily movement preserved in the grain of the wood. The walls were white plaster, cracked finely in one corner near the ceiling in the way of old plaster that has moved with the house through many winters and has earned its imperfections. Along the back wall, built-in shelves held a careful arrangement of things, folded linens, a row of canning jars, a small stack of books with spines too faded to read from across the room, and at the end of the row, a framed photograph that Iris crossed the room to look at before she had taken off her coat. It was her mother, Opel in a summer dress, standing in the meadow outside, the maples behind her younger and thinner than they were now, the meadow grass around her waist-high and full of what looked like black-eyed Susans. She was smiling. Iris had a large collection of photographs of her mother, and in very few of them was Opel smiling in the unguarded way she was smiling in this one, the smile of someone caught in a moment of genuine happiness, rather than performing happiness for a camera. She was perhaps 60 in the photograph. The property would have been hers for just a few years at that point. She was standing in her meadow in her summer dress, and she was happy in a way Iris had not known her mother had access to. She set her bag down. She went through each room slowly. The kitchen was small and functional, with a hand pump at the sink that she tested without expectation, and that produced, after 3 long strokes, actual water, cold and clear, which surprised her enough that she laughed, the first time she had laughed in longer than she could immediately remember. The bedroom held a narrow iron bed frame and a quilt folded at the foot of it, a double wedding ring pattern in blues and creams that Iris recognized as her grandmother's work, the same pattern as one of the quilts in the cedar chest she had put in storage, made by the same hands, the stitching tight and even in the way of someone who has been sewing long enough that precision is no longer effort but simply the way the hands move. She sat on the edge of the bed and held the quilt in her lap and thought about her grandmother, who had died before Iris was old enough to have real memories of her, and about Opel, who had kept this quilt here rather than at home, and about what it meant that her mother had furnished this place with the things that carried the most weight, not the decorative things, not the things meant to impress, but the things that connected one generation to the next by the simple fact of having been made by hand. There was a desk in the small room off the kitchen that might have been intended as a pantry, and that Opel had fitted with a writing surface and a single shelf above it. On the shelf was a wooden box, the kind with a simple latch, the kind her mother had kept sewing notions in for as long as Iris could remember. She opened it. Inside were documents, neatly folded, the original purchase agreement for the property, dated June 1987, tax receipts going back to the same year, paid annually without interruption, a hand-drawn map of the property boundaries in her mother's careful handwriting, and a single envelope with Iris's name on the front, in the same handwriting, sealed. She did not open it immediately. She sat at her mother's desk in the small room off the kitchen and held the envelope and looked at her name written in her mother's hand and felt the specific and indescribable sensation of receiving something from a person who is no longer there to give it in person. The grief and the gratitude arriving together, which was how they had always arrived since Opel died, indistinguishable from each other in the way of things that come from the same source. She set the envelope on the desk. She got up. She made tea on the small gas stove that lit on the second try. She brought the cup to the window that faced the meadow, and she stood and looked at the black-eyed Susans that had gone to seed for the season, and the maples beyond them blazing in the last of the afternoon light, and the slice of lake visible between the 2 largest trees. Then she went back to the desk, sat down, and opened the envelope. The letter Opel had written was not long. It was 3 paragraphs in the careful, economical hand of a woman who had spent a lifetime saying only what needed to be said. She had purchased the property in the summer of 1987, she wrote, with money she had saved over many years from the bookkeeping work and from a period of particularly steady seamstress contracts in the early 1980s. The property had been inexpensive then. Calder's Landing had not yet been discovered by the people who discover places and change them. She had seen the land and the lake and the meadow, and she had thought of Iris. She had wanted, she wrote, to give her daughter something that no circumstance could take away, something in her daughter's name, paid for outright, attached to nothing and owed to no one. She had not told her because she had wanted it to be there waiting, the way good things sometimes wait, for the moment it was most needed. At the bottom, in the slightly looser handwriting of the last years of her life, she had added 1 line. She had written, "I always knew you would be all right. I just wanted to make sure." Iris folded the letter and put it back in the envelope, and put the envelope in the inside pocket of her coat, next to the key. She sat at her mother's desk in the gathering dark, and did not try to contain what she was feeling, because it was not the kind of thing that contains. She let it be as large as it was. After a while she got up and lit the lamp on the kitchen table and made supper from the canned goods she had brought in her bag, and she ate at the table her mother had eaten at, in the house her mother had kept for her, and she slept that night in the bed under her grandmother's quilt and did not wake until morning. Sterling Ames appeared on the 3rd day. He came up the flat stone path in the particular manner of a man who has decided in advance that the conversation will go the way he has planned it, wearing the assured, expensive casualness of someone for whom confidence has long since stopped requiring effort. He was perhaps 60, with a business card he produced immediately and a smile that arrived slightly before it was warranted. He introduced himself and named his development company and said he had heard she had arrived, which told her that Calder's Landing was the kind of small town where arrivals are noted. He explained what the property was worth to him. The area had grown considerably in the past decade, he said. The lake frontage on this side of town was among the most desirable in the county. Her parcel, with its position and its acreage, was something he had been watching for some time. He stated a number. It was a large number. She thanked him and told him she was not interested in selling. He left his card on the porch railing in the manner of a man who believes that most positions are temporary. August Fielding came down the gravel road 2 days later on foot, which distinguished him immediately from Sterling Ames. He was a man of perhaps 70 who walked with the unhurried attention of someone who looks at the landscape rather than past it. He introduced himself as a land conservationist who had worked in the region for 30 years and explained that he had heard from someone at the county records office that the Trescott property had a new occupant. He asked if she would mind talking. She said she would not mind. He spent an afternoon walking the property with her. He knew things about it she did not know, that the meadow had never been treated with pesticides and had retained a native wildflower composition that was increasingly rare in the region, that the stand of maples along the northern boundary included several trees old enough to predate European settlement of the area, that the lake access from the lower edge of the property was one of the last undeveloped points on the eastern shore. He spoke about these things with the precise affection of someone who has spent decades paying attention to land that most people look at without seeing. He told her that the property, handled correctly, qualified for a conservation easement that would reduce her tax burden significantly while protecting the land from the kind of development Sterling Ames had in mind. He put her in contact with Lenora Hatch, an attorney in Burlington who specialized in exactly this kind of arrangement and who, when Iris called her the following morning, confirmed everything August had described and added that the easement combined with a carefully structured rental agreement on the cottage would produce a modest but stable income. Enough, Lenora said, with the directness of someone who has spent 30 years being accurate rather than reassuring, for a person living simply to live well. Iris thanked her. She sat with the information for 2 days, the way she sat with everything that mattered, quietly and without rushing the conclusion. She called Roberta on a Sunday evening, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp on and the dark meadow outside the window and the sound of the wind moving through the maples in the way it had been moving through them for longer than anyone currently alive could remember. She told her daughter what she had decided. There was a silence, and then Roberta said, "Are you sure?" which was the same question she had asked before Iris left Millbrook, and which meant the same thing it had meant then, not doubt, but love expressed as caution, the way Roberta had always expressed it. Iris said yes, she was sure. She had been sure since the second morning, when she had walked the property alone before the light was fully up and had stood at the lower edge of the meadow where it met the tree line, and looked at the lake through the birches in the early grey of a Vermont October dawn, and had understood, without deliberation, that she was not going to leave. Roberta was quiet for a moment. Then she asked the practical questions, because she was a practical woman, and because the practical questions were the way she showed up for the people she loved. How would Iris manage the property taxes? What would she do for income? Had she spoken to anyone about the legal situation, about whether the deed was unencumbered, about what owning property in Vermont at 81 actually required in terms of maintenance and planning? Iris answered each question in turn, calmly and specifically, because she had spent the 2 weeks since arriving thinking through exactly these things, writing the numbers on a legal pad the way she had always worked through the things that required working through, looking at them without the distortion of either hope or fear. She had the figures. She had thought about the options. She was not acting on feeling alone, though feeling was present and large. She was acting on the combination of feeling and reason that had guided every significant decision of her 81 years, and she trusted it. Roberta listened. At the end she said, "All right, Mum." And then she said, "Grandma Opel really knew what she was doing." Iris said yes, she did. That was the thing about Opel, she said. She always knew what she was doing. She just didn't always tell you about it in advance. She stayed through the winter. It was not a mild winter. Vermont in January and February is not mild, and the property was not built for ease, and there were mornings when the hand pump required coaxing, and evenings when the wind found the gaps in the window frames her mother had not gotten around to sealing, and one week in late January when the temperature dropped low enough that the water in the hand pump line froze, and she had to manage with the jugs she had filled in advance, which she had done because August Fielding had warned her this could happen, and she had listened. She had her fireproof box shipped from Roberta's basement with the documents she needed. She had the cedar chest brought up as well, because the quilts were hers and the winter was cold. She managed the practical difficulties of the season the way she had managed every practical difficulty of the past 81 years, by addressing each one in the right order, without dramatizing the ones that could be solved, or wasting energy on the ones that could not. August Fielding checked in on her twice during the winter months, arriving on foot down the gravel road in the particular unhurried way that she had come to recognize as characteristic of him, bringing news of the easement progress and occasionally a container of soup from a place in town that he said made the only chowder worth eating in the county. She accepted both the news and the soup with the same gracious directness she applied to everything, and she found that she genuinely enjoyed his company in the specific way of someone who has moved to a new place and discovered unexpectedly that it contains people worth knowing. He knew things about the history of the land that she had not thought to ask about, that the property had been a small working farm in the late 19th century, that the stone foundation visible at the northeast corner of the meadow was all that remained of an outbuilding that had stood until sometime in the 1930s, that the oldest of the maples along the northern boundary had been measured by a dendrochronologist from the university at over 300 years old. 300 years. The tree had been standing when the land was still forest with no path through it and no name attached to it in any European record. Her mother had bought land that contained a 300-year-old maple and had mentioned it to no one. This was so precisely characteristic of Opel that Iris did not know whether to laugh or to cry and settled, as she often did with things involving her mother, on something between the two. Lenora Hatch finalized the conservation easement in February, which reduced the annual property tax assessment to a figure Iris could manage on her Social Security and Edmund's small pension with enough margin that she did not need to worry, which was not the same as being comfortable in the way she had been comfortable on Sycamore Lane, but was something she understood how to live inside. She had lived inside tighter margins than this. Her mother had lived inside tighter margins than this, and had still managed to save enough, carefully and over many years, to buy a piece of Vermont lakeside land in 1987 and pay the taxes on it for 26 years without telling anyone. If Opel could do that on a seamstress's wages, Iris could manage what she had. August sent a colleague from the Land Trust to document the meadow's native species composition in the early spring, a young woman named, she introduced herself as a botanist, who spent 2 full days on her knees in the meadow with a clipboard and a hand lens, and the specific absorption of someone doing work they genuinely love. She identified 43 native species in the meadow, including 3 that she said were locally uncommon, and 1 that she said was, in this part of Vermont, genuinely rare. She explained all of this to Iris over tea at the kitchen table on the second evening, with the kind of enthusiastic precision that young people bring to subjects they have decided matter, and Iris listened with genuine interest and thought about her mother standing in this meadow in a summer dress in the photograph on the shelf, surrounded by black-eyed Susans, smiling the unguarded smile of someone who has found a thing worth protecting and has quietly gone about protecting it. Sterling Ames drove slowly past on a Wednesday in March. He did not stop. He did not leave a card. She watched him go from the kitchen window and felt nothing particular about it, which was itself a kind of answer to a question she had not consciously been asking. Roberta came in April, when the meadow was beginning to come back and the black-eyed Susans were showing the first green of the season at the base of the previous year's stalks. She drove up from Columbus on a Friday and arrived in the late afternoon with a bag of groceries and the particular efficient energy of a woman who has decided that the best way to support her mother is to show up and be useful. She spent the first evening fixing the gaps in the 2 window frames that Iris had been managing with rolled towels since November, and Iris sat at the kitchen table and watched her daughter work and felt the specific quality of gratitude that has nowhere particular to direct itself and simply fills the room. She placed her mother's photograph on the shelf beside the front window, in the same position it had held on the built-in shelf when she arrived, because some arrangements are correct and do not need to be reconsidered. She placed Edmund's photograph beside it, because they had been beside each other for 50 years and she saw no reason to stop now. She read from the Bible most mornings at the kitchen table, in the chair that faced the window that faced the meadow, the same way she had read it on the nightstand side of the bed in Millbrook, and the same way Opel had read it before her, and Opel's mother before that. The book was very old now, and its spine was held together by habit as much as by binding, and she handled it with the care you give to things that have lasted long enough to become irreplaceable. There were people in Calder's Landing who had known her mother, she discovered over the spring and into the summer. The woman who ran the post office remembered Opel coming in to collect mail during the summers. A quiet woman, she said, very polite, always had a word for everyone but never stayed long. The man at the hardware store said he had fixed the hand pump once, maybe 15 years ago, at the request of a Mrs. Trescott, who had called from out of state and arranged payment by check in advance before he had even confirmed he could do the job, which he had found unusual and efficient in equal measure. These small pieces arrived one at a time and assembled themselves gradually into a picture of her mother's life in this place, a life Iris had known nothing about, a life Opel had lived quietly and alone and with apparent contentment for decades. The picture they assembled was recognizable. It was Opel. It was exactly what Opel would have done and how she would have done it, and the recognizability of it was its own form of comfort. On an evening in late May, she sat in the chair on the front porch and watched the light go off the meadow. The black-eyed Susans were fully up. The maples had their summer leaves. The lake was visible between the two largest trees at the bottom of the slope, reflecting the last of the sky in the particular way of still water at dusk, which takes the colors of the sky and holds them a moment longer than the sky holds them itself, as though unwilling to let the light go. A heron stood motionless at the water's edge, doing what herons do at dusk, which is to be so still they become part of the landscape rather than visitors to it. She held the key in her hand. The cardboard tag was soft now from handling, the word her mother had written still legible but faint at the edges. Yours. She had been turning it over in her hand since the night in room 9 of the Millbrook Inn, and she suspected she would keep turning it over for whatever time remained to her, not out of habit but out of something closer to gratitude, the ongoing and daily kind that does not diminish with repetition. Her mother had bought this land when Iris was 43 years old. She had kept it for 26 years without saying a word. She had placed the deed in the one book she knew her daughter would always keep. She had written one word on a cardboard tag and tied it to a key and trusted that love, planned carefully and held quietly across decades and through death itself, finds its way home. It had. Iris was in it. She thought about the bank's letter arriving on a Monday in October, in an ordinary white envelope between a water bill and a catalogue, and she thought about room 9 of the Millbrook Inn, and the Bible falling open to Psalms, and the key on its cardboard tag, and the deed folded carefully in her mother's hand. She thought about all the things that had to happen in exactly the order they happened for her to be sitting in this chair, on this porch, watching this heron at this hour. She did not believe in accidents. She had not believed in them for a long time. She believed in the kind of love that thinks further ahead than the person receiving it can see, and that keeps working quietly long after the person giving it is gone. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.